I'm Zeichick with NetEvents TV. We're going to talk about disaggregated software stacks and why openness is the key to success in the networking industry. When we talk about open networks, what do you mean by that? What parts of the network must be open for it to be an open network?
You can't automate an infrastructure that is not programmable, and therefore the critical piece here is for devices to have open APIs. That's the foundation, that's the starting point.
So disaggregated networks is really the idea of being able to separate the control plane from the data plane in networking. So in a networking stack, you have a data plane that's actually forwarding packets within the network, and then you have a control plane where you're managing where those packets should be going. And so when you disaggregate those two things and you have a data plane and a control plane that are managed separately, that's disaggregating the network stack. At least that's the way I think about it.
What Dell EMC defines as disaggregation is really twofold. The first is what we did approximately 4 years ago, where we disaggregated the hardware and software. In other words, enabling companies the capability to run various types of network operating software on their infrastructure. Dell takes care of the infrastructure and builds it, best of breed using commodity hardware and third-party ASICs, some of our own intelligent IP built into that. Through our open source OPX project, we have the software that maintains and basically best utilizes that hardware, brings the switch abstraction out of the ASIC to a control plane that you can put connected APIs. And then obviously you can connect any of our software partners, whether it be Cumulus or Big Switch or some of the others, or you can continue to run the Dell EMC operating software, and that's our OS 10. So that's the first part of disaggregation, is that you don't have to have this lock-in between the hardware and software. The second is what we're seeing is moving very quickly is actually the disaggregation of the software itself. I've said many times that customers are paying for this proprietary stack, and in this stack there's 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, 900, whatever the feature may be, but the number of protocols that have been built up in the networking industry over the last 25, 30 years, when they find themselves at the core, in the campus, or at the edge, using a tenth of those particular protocols. So why are they paying for them? So we see more and more of the capability to disaggregate the software stack to allow customers to run those particular features or protocols or even open source software that allows them to, again, run their applications and run their infrastructure in the best way that they need to based upon their outcomes or their particular environment and the resources that they have. They can capitalize on more compute resources rather than raising up the level of network engineers that they may have to have as they scale out their network if they use this disaggregated approach to both hardware and software.
How do we ensure openness? Do we have industry consortia? Do we have standards bodies? Do we have APIs? How do we make sure that networks are open?
So I think one of the things you have to be concerned with is an OINO platform, which is open in name only. And so what you have to have there is some type of standard. What's different now is it doesn't have to be an IEEE or an IETF standard. We see things like OCP, which is the Open Compute Project, that standardize SCI, which is the abstraction interface that allows us to build different operating systems on top of that. We see ONI, which also came out of the OCP organization, that lets you boot different operating systems. And now the market is going to drive that. So we have people that can run Sonic on top of the Mellanox hardware or on top of our competitors' hardware. The market is embracing that, and the customers are saying, I want that choice of hardware and software. So we need to build the APIs, we need to standardize on those, and then the market will force people to actually embrace real open platforms and not just these OINO platforms, open in name only.
The drive needs to come from, one, the customers, which more and more are embracing disaggregation and use of open source. We see that more, not just in the web scale companies, but also in large enterprises, universities, particular sectors or vertical markets that are embracing this disaggregation and are looking to unlock themselves from proprietary hardware and software. So I think the customers need to drive it. And they're going to drive it because of this digital transformation that's occurring. They know the traditional network's not going to take them where they want to be. I think the second thing is that the industry in and of itself, us as OEMs in the networking space, the silicon providers and so forth need to also embrace it. We need to recognize that this is what's best for our customers, to take advantage of what's happening with the technology to enable new services and new capabilities in their environment. And Dell has always embraced that. If you think of the PC, if you think of the introduction of the x86, if you think of us continuing to drive down the cost of these sensors and these capabilities, that's to enable technology. And so we as OEMs, we have to embrace it. And obviously we were one of the first to contribute source through with Microsoft, with Sonic into OCP, our OPX work in the Linux Foundation, and we're starting to see other companies start to embrace it. Obviously, you have the uptick in companies such as Barefoot, which is contributing through its P4, some of the programmability of its ASICs in open source. We've heard others such as Mellanox and Apstra and so on contributing to these open source communities. So I think it's a combination of both. One, it's being driven by the customers. I hope and would be proud to say that part of that was started by Dell EMC 4 years ago. And then two, the contributions, I think, coming from both the customers, but then more importantly, the industry itself.
This may seem like a stupid question, but what are the benefits of open networking? Why do we really care whether we have openness or vendor lock-in?
The benefit to customers is choice. They can choose the best of breed elements at every one of those layers. Or they can decide to choose the cheapest or the most cost-effective options. It becomes really their choice of how they want to build their networks, which will drive efficiencies, costs, and really tailor the infrastructure to their applications.
We've seen a lot of movement in the networking industry to embrace open standards. And so that means that networking vendors are increasingly offering software management platforms for controlling the network. And increasingly they're enabling the control of infrastructure that maybe they didn't build. So we're seeing these network management systems that can run on any hardware. It doesn't necessarily have to be from one vendor. And when you do that, it enables a whole bunch of opportunities for folks to have more freedom of choice of where they buy their hardware from. So they could buy it directly from their traditional vendor. They could buy it from OEMs who are creating some of this hardware and then run software on top of it. And so what's going to be key to enabling this in the future is really customers desiring this and expressing to their vendors that they want to have more openness in their networking platforms.
Are there drawbacks to having networks be too open? For example, does openness and the quest for standards perhaps limit the pace of innovation?
You know, I think the only drawback that you might see with openness is that you have to choose wisely on both the hardware and the software. But because you're not locked into a specific vendor, it allows you to be more agile. So even if you make the wrong decision initially, you can correct very, very quickly. And that's part of the agility that you're gaining. If you choose a vendor and for whatever reason that vendor doesn't execute or they shift directions and go off on another tangent, you're actually able to move your operating system to another platform. Or if the hardware vendor that you've chosen is actually stops executing or they have problems with their silicon at the ASIC level and they start dropping packets like we've seen some of our competitors do, you can choose the best-in-class hardware. So really, in the grand scheme of things, you can make a wrong decision, but then you can very quickly get onto a new good direction with an open platform.
I would say that the challenge with open networking is that if done wrong, choice could imply complexity. That's where having one throat to choke, vendors that can come in and enable choice while reducing the risk by supporting the entire solution, including the choice of components, that becomes important.
You know, I think that the timing is interesting to look at. I think 3 or 4 years ago when we first announced disaggregation and this whole concept around open networking, I love how often the words are being used now. I think it was starting a little slow, but the time is moving quite rapidly. So I think the adoption is coming very, very quickly. I think to the point of what's the risk. You know, if I stay proprietary, does it just work? And then therefore I've got these, very trained engineers that understand how it works and so forth. Well, when you have a company such as Dell EMC that tests that stack, that certifies that stack, that will support the stack, whether it's our software or a third-party software, call Dell and we're going to help you drive the root cause of the issue. which, by the way, that's what we're doing in the network industry, and it's absolutely the same what we did from the mainframe to the x86. You know, many people were worried about, well, the mainframe is proprietary, it runs our applications, it doesn't break, da-da-da, da-da-da. Dell and others, IBM, Compaq, HP, they showed that the x86 commodity-based server had the capability to run those applications, and the services and support and logistics and worldwide capability of Dell also was able to support the customer. And so more and more of those applications are moving to that particular area. We think the same is true, and that Dell EMC can help these customers go towards this open environment because we're here to stand behind them and make sure that they have success.
Where does this open networking movement go from here? I mean, more open, what comes next?
Well, open networking is the future. We've seen the trend start with the largest hyperscales. We've seen the trend start with the vendors that were promoting, the newer vendors that were promoting this openness. But now every organization out there is asking for open networking, and every vendor, including the established vendors, are jumping on the bandwagon. So I think it's here to stay, and it's the future.
Open networking is still in the early stages at this point, but we are seeing, particularly on the upper end of the network, from hyperscalers and big service providers, they've been embracing open networking because they're able to optimize the infrastructure and the software running on top of it to their specific needs. And when you're able to do that, you can gain tremendous efficiencies in your networking stack. But for this to really move down into the mainstream enterprise, we're going to need to see it more accessible to have vendors who are able to sort of make this easy to use out of the box and allow customers to customize it to their what they really need from the network. And I think we're still a little ways from that.
I think a lot's happened in the last 4 years. If you think that we were the first to disaggregate hardware and software, in this last year and a half, Juniper, Arista, and Cisco have all announced the disaggregation of their software to one on what we call white box switching. So it's great that we led, but now there's followers. And I think over the next 4 years, you're going to see a massive adoption of this disaggregated NOS. This capability to run particular features on the switch that you need for your particular outcomes. And I think companies that are embracing this, such as Mellanox, Cumulus, Big Switch, Dell EMC, we've heard from many others. And then customers such as Microsoft, and you've heard lots of stories about AT&T and what they're doing with creating their own NOS in their environment and switching all of their 60,000 plus or tens of thousands of plus routers with white box switches. I think over the next 4 years, the disaggregation of hardware and software is going to evolve to this disaggregation of software from the core to the campus, all the way to the edge, and even in data center interconnectivity.
So I don't know that necessarily open networking is going to go to standards bodies because, like I said, it's really the market that's driving this today. And so there's enough standardization that's happening at the API and interface level. We do see new things now happening in the Linux kernel, things like SwitchDev, for example. We see the SCI layer, the ONI layer, all of those things are enablers. And then the market is going to actually drive the standardization so that people can mix and match hardware and software. So I think we have everything we need today. The old days of the IEEE or the IETF defining everything, I think, are behind us. They do a great job at the physical layer of defining these things. But at what we're talking about at this layer, I think we've broken some of the historical, traditional methodologies where the big vendors got to control everything. And really, towards the end of vendor lock-in, the industry with these hyperscalers have broken that. Their scale and the amount that they buy, they're not letting anybody lock them in. They're not letting you lock in the optics to their switch. They'll buy best in class across everything, hardware, software, cables. And that's the market that's driving that.
As you've heard, open networks are the future of networking. For NetEvents TV, I'm Alan Zeichick.